All right, I'll go ahead and get us started, and we probably will have some people join us in the next few minutes, but we'll get started so we don't go too far over. Innovation and technology has allowed us to make great strides in terms of medical science and treatments. Gene therapies, which are in a lot of cases specifically targeted to a patient's DNA, are a great example of this. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, they are very expensive. The cost of development is high, and we're going to discuss some of the ways that we can look at paying for these treatments. And for that, I'm going to turn us over to JP Weisky, who is one of our ALEC HHS task force members and serves as the Vice President of State Affairs for the Campaign for Transformative Therapies. Also, we'll have time for questions at the end of the program, so after the speakers finish.
Yeah, thank you, Brooklyn. We've got an opportunity here, and we wanted to talk a little bit about gene therapies and value-based payment arrangements that are attaching. First, a brief introduction as to who we are. We are the Campaign for Transformative Therapies. The group was brought together to deal with a variety of drug payment issues, but especially the expected relatively high cost gene therapies and other therapies that people are going to be seeing in the coming years, and trying to develop payment arrangements that create sustainable financing of gene therapies. As from a membership standpoint, it is a broad-based membership. The Campaign for Transformative Therapies is a campaign of a group called the Council for Affordable Health Coverage. CAHC is a broad-based coalition, across multiple lines, including employers, insurers, pharma, PBMs, and others. The coalition specifically is a little bit more focused, given that it's more focused on drug costs. It is a coalition of payers and pharma companies and patient advocacy groups to discuss these things. We're looking for sustainable financing of these arrangements and these costs. And we're looking to find a balance between access, costs, and outcomes. Too often, we see patient access restricted in a number of cases, especially for life-altering situations. And we're hopeful that we can find some ways to ensure that states are paying for an effective solution. I'm going to now turn it over to Michael Heifetz, a former Medicaid director in the state of Wisconsin and former budget director, who's going to discuss a little bit about gene therapies and discuss Medicaid financing. Over to you, Michael.
Great, thanks, JP. And real quick background, as JP mentioned, former state budget director, former Medicaid director as well in Wisconsin, and also ran a Medicaid health plan in another Midwestern state. So I've come across these issues at various levels and now consulting with the Campaign for Transformative Therapies. Don't worry, I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to give you an in-depth PhD level of gene therapy, but as Brooklyn mentioned, these really get right at the DNA. So that gets at significant development costs and actual costs once these are ready for market, so to speak. You can see a little bit of data here. We all have 20,000 genes. There are 6,000 plus genetically based diseases. So these therapies go right at that level and potentially fix a harmful gene or remove a harmful gene or reduce the activity, another way of fixing it. So you can see a few of the diseases here that typically we are talking about, and there'll be more in the future, which is another reason this is a timely conversation, because this is really in some ways early on in the gene therapy world, but is growing significantly by the year. But hemophilia, inherited retinal diseases, and some other ones that you can see here on the screen are being explored, and treatments are coming to market in the very near future, occasionally delayed through the approval process, as you can understand, but they're coming, and some are out there already, and we'll talk about a couple of examples as we go. So let's move on, JP. these are life-changing, literally. Spinal muscular atrophy for kids under 2 is a really debilitating disease and really restricts functionality for those children. And Zolgensma can make a big difference in what their capabilities can be and what their, what a so-called normal childhood can look like for folks who have this disease. So it's a huge lift in this realm. And you see a number, SRP 9001 for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Similar dynamics there, where these can be life-altering in how a person can perform daily functions and live what we refer to as a normal life. As we move to hereditary retinal dystrophy, Luxturna is the brand name you've probably heard of and seen, and that can take blindness and transform it into, at a minimum, seeing light and dark differences, but then potentially even well beyond that. Hemophilia, we always hear about that historically with the czar and his kids, but there are multiple candidates in the pipeline for this, probably coming in the next year or 2. There have been no FDA approvals as of yet, but the current treatment, and it's really the consistent treatment over decades at this point, is giving these members, these Medicaid members or patients, blood factor. So that hasn't changed in a long time, and this would be completely altering that. Factor costs tens of thousands of dollars, if not 6 figures a year, depending on the person's condition within hemophilia. And I can tell you that as a health plan CEO, if you have even a few such members and one of them or 2 of them need surgery, which means they will need more factor during a particular time, that alone can alter the care given to the member, of course, and also substantially alters the cost very quickly. So translate that to a Medicaid program, and it gets exponentially higher as the numbers in Medicaid programs are huge across the country, regardless of the model. As you can see here, these are truly transformative, but look at the price tags on a lot of these. So we have current therapies such as Spinraza, up to $750,000 a year. And then it goes by a weight-based method, but still hundreds of thousands a year. And under the new, we're going to have 2 million. But the capabilities of the people being treated with this will be substantively different and truly transforming them. And then it's a dilemma of how do we measure that financially, potentially. And those are very difficult conversations. We mentioned hemophilia in the pipeline candidates, and I mentioned some of those $100,000 figures plus. So you can see here, well over $500,000 in certain cases. We do not have a price tag yet on what these new therapies will cost, but they're likely to be in the 7 figures based on publicly released information over the last year or 2. So again, the dilemma is pretty clear. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we're heading into a rapidly changing environment. You can see some data on the screen from last year. 2 have been approved, and we have more coming. And then you see this 63 coming for approval by 2030. That seems a long time from now, but it really isn't. And 63 in a few years means 10 to 20 in a shorter period of time than that. That will be impacting people's lives, patient and families' lives, as well as Medicaid programs and commercial programs from the cost side. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, the balancing issue that JP mentioned at the front end of this conversation. And you can see some other data from about a year ago today. We'll be able to update this in the very near future with new data, but you can see some new data on how many of these are in the phase 1, 2, and 3 categories. So phase 1 is quite a ways away, holistically speaking, from reaching market. Phase 2 is further along in understanding the efficacy of the new treatment. And phase 3 is the real serious trials and measuring how they're truly working on a subset of the folks with that condition. So much closer at the phase 3 level. So this gets into healthcare financing, of course, which is why we're all here. And we've talked about the cost, quality, and access to a degree, but we have often seen that we can only deliver on 2 of these components, or at least that has been the model and sometimes the goal, unfortunately. But we can do better, and it can be done through some models we'll talk about today. So getting at the cost and the quality and the access, really a 3-legged stool, which if it is in balance, can stand securely. Some of you, depending on where you are, which states you're in, you will have different methods of Medicaid financing. We have states like Montana and Connecticut, 2 very divergent politically, but both still in traditional fee-for-service, meaning the Medicaid program is essentially processing claims and paying providers for those claims, measuring efficacy and quality to a degree, but typically not at the same level. I say typically because there are always exceptions, so I don't want to get into trouble. But then we also have the more common and still expanding managed care model, which is probably what most of you are more familiar with. You know the basics of it, contracting with managed care organizations. In some states, you could have even just 1, but typically 3 or 4. I'm in an unusual state with about 14. Texas and Michigan also have much higher numbers. So we can talk about that on another discussion. But it's really creating incentives for the insurers to manage the costs and manage the care. Sometimes that's done through some rather challenging instruments, restricting access through the utilization review process, which is what all of us see when we're trying to get care for our families. Going through bureaucracy and paperwork to get prior approval or later approval, or a specialist signing off, all those kinds of things that managed care organizations use to manage the cost, keep it down while ensuring that the right people are getting the right treatment if we have to go more expensive and aggressive routes. And it obviously helps states manage their budgets. It's predictable. It typically increases year to year, but at least it is a predictable increase that state budget managers can plan for. And you don't have the same level of shock that a fee-for-service system might potentially give you. On the risk-sharing sides, some states will protect themselves even further through reinsurance or risk pools, and that helps the MCOs as well through the mechanisms of their own risk pool. They may draw a more challenging population from a degree of illness side, and this protects them from those types of more random situations that are out of their control. The drug coverage aspect itself is often broken out separately. Most states have a preferred drug list, or they contract out to form a preferred drug list. The utilization management tools are still there, which you will often see as the fail first type of policies, which obviously upset patients and advocates and can just often make the process slow down quite a bit. And some states will use a carve out of the drug benefit. Sometimes it is partial, just using it for certain classes of drugs, or actually certain drugs themselves that they believe that the state believes it can purchase for a more valuable, in a more valuable equation. And then there are a few states, Wisconsin is one of them, that does essentially a full carve out of the drug benefit. We use the managed care organizations for delivering care, but when drugs are prescribed and treatments are prescribed, they are then paid for and negotiated through the state rather than the managed care organizations. They're really just on the back end of the equation with no financial stake, so to speak. So as we focus on the drug spend, we look at the access and how that's limited. We talked a little bit about that. PBMs have a significant role here. I know that's controversial in some states, but they often bring some great value and can improve patient care if used appropriately. On the cost side, the states have a variety of cost limits through the federal government and the Medicaid program and the federal state partnership. So states get the best deal, essentially. And then we talked about some of the risk sharing mechanisms just a minute ago, but that federal component of getting the best price will come up again here in a few minutes as we talk about moving towards value-based arrangements. On the quality side, Medicaid is requiring coverage of all medications, so that doesn't sound like it's really connected to quality. And that's part of where we're going to talk about this in another minute as well. Rather than just coverage and access, actually measuring how well these drugs are performing and are patients seeing the lifestyle improvements that are being clinically expected according to the metrics. So we'll move on to that very shortly, which is really the crux of it. So for the gene therapies, we talked a little bit more about this, so I don't want to beat it too hard. It's costly, but can be life-changing, revolutionary. And there have been, however, efforts to restrict access, not specific at these drugs, but specific at their pricing and at the difficulty of managing Medicaid programs when you can be slammed with $1 million cases, which in large programs doesn't sound like a lot, but in a few years, when there are many more of these treatments out, this will be a significant problem. So Medicaid programs that can get ahead of it will be at an advantage and not have to pursue these limiting access mechanisms that will be even more difficult to sustain from a patient and member perspective, given the severity of the diseases we're discussing today. So as we mentioned, we'll be looking at this now. And the issue here, you see all the balancing mechanisms in the photo. This is the dilemma for state policymakers as they wrestle and you wrestle with these new treatments and how to achieve that three-legged stool.
And we wanted to get into a little bit into the nitty-gritty about what we're talking about here. Now, we've used OBAs, and you've probably heard of OBAs, VBAs, VBPs. Functionally, they are interchangeable terms. So we want you to understand that. VBP, value-based payment arrangements, is the current term that CMS is using related to the gene therapies. That's to differentiate from the outcome-based arrangements in other and medical sort of terms. Part of what we're looking at in this is a balance between cost and access, like we've talked about. What a lot of the companies are interested in is broad patient access, the ability of patients to be able to access the medications without having to go through significant steps, or limiting access to only a few people. But there also needs to be a sustainable reimbursement strategy for Medicaid, because again, to Michael's point, if you're looking at a multi-million-dollar or $1 million claim, that's a significant impact on Medicaid. And if you multiply that by the number of patients in your state, that's significant in any one year. And part of the idea is paying for value, paying to share the risk and holding the manufacturer accountable for when the drug works and when it doesn't work. And so you're specifically measuring outcomes, and through measuring outcomes and looking at this, you're trying to broaden access and improve patient lives while still being able to balance the overall cost structure. So how do they work? Functionally, if you look at a contract, typical contract, and there is no typical contract, but functionally, the Medicaid department is making an agreement with the drug manufacturer. This agreement includes discussions about who gets access to this. That's a very important piece, because not only does it impact the cost, but it also impacts how you're going to look at the risk structure. The broader the access, the harder it is for the drug manufacturer to maybe hit certain risk structures. So they're going to have an interest in focusing on those risk structures as a piece of it. And then looking at the overall cost of the drug. And again, in some cases, there have been models, payment models that differ significantly from the typical structure. The agreement provides broad access, as I said, only to eligible patients. So there's a narrow subset, and the patient outcomes have to be tracked. And there's a variety of ways to do that. We can talk about that if there's questions. This is where it gets a little bit complicated. Claims history is something that's very easy to use. Medical records require a hands-on sort of relationship, which makes it a little bit more costly to monitor. Sometimes there's specific testing that attaches. We were talking about earlier the drug that deals with retinopathy, and in that case, you're looking at light tests that are specific to that drug going forward. And you measure the effectiveness. And again, depending on the cost of the specific gene therapy, it may be done on a population basis, or it actually may be, the pricing may be based on a patient by patient basis. So any patient that it doesn't work for, there's a significant amount of money that comes back into the Medicaid department. Types of OBAs, as we talked about. First, obviously, we've talked about outcomes that determine reimbursement and looking at those and hitting targets, often on a patient-by-patient basis. There's a warranty model. Again, you're looking in that model at the overall effectiveness. There's discussion about payment over time. That sort of reflects the idea that if you've got especially a Medicaid patient, and they've got a debilitating condition, that their ability to stay off the more costly drugs as an alternative, that you're allowed to pay for the gene therapy over time, even though it may only be one treatment. And then there's some reinsurance that limits the cost of the specific insurers, as we talked about. And I think before Michael will finish up here and talk about what we're looking at from a state perspective and how states are looking at it. But the idea here, I think, is that we can ensure broad access and control costs. And and drug manufacturers are comfortable with this approach because they have an ability now to share risks as a piece of this. And so the idea is a Medicaid, you're paying more for more effective treatments, you're paying less for less effective treatments.
And to preface that a little more, as a Medicaid director, some of the manufacturers of the more expensive treatments and drugs would come in and make a pitch, literally, about their drugs, but there often wasn't a lot of data or willingness to engage in some kind of risk-sharing arrangement. It was much more of a, hey, give broad access, and yes, it'll cost a lot, but you should give broad access. And it was sort of a binary conversation. And those conversations didn't get that far. And as a Medicaid director and as a health plan CEO, I didn't want to be in the position of denying someone's care. And fortunately, I wasn't, but still had to manage the bottom line and also quality. So even if we were going to give broad access, we wanted to know if these drugs were working and if these treatments were working as they were being pitched in that regard. So we've talked quite a bit about the right side of the screen. You can imagine some of the challenges, and JP mentioned some of those, the objective outcomes, the criteria, the data. How are we evaluating that? Is it claims data? Is it the medical record itself? Is it other forms? Do you use a third party to evaluate how this is working? How would you select those third parties? Medicaid departments typically have to use a third party if they have an 1115 waiver today within their Medicaid program to evaluate access or success of that waiver. So third party evaluation shouldn't be that big of a hurdle, but you have to make sure that third party has these capabilities. Your internal team at the Medicaid program has to be able to manage these sorts of contractual mechanisms as well as the clinical metrics side of the equation. And providers will obviously be involved. And while that's a challenge, it can also be an opportunity, particularly on the side of children's diseases, where children's hospitals typically have significant expertise and can frankly help guide what the clinical outcomes should be and how to measure them. So not over-influencing, but having a positive influence. But there can also be significant resistance in just wanting access with no discussion of quality or cost. We'll talk about federal ambiguity momentarily, but that's one of the challenges here. And that's really where some of the solutions come into play from a state perspective, and you in each state managing your own vision and version of value-based arrangements. So some of those policy barriers are right in front of you. It's just difficult at the federal level. Medicaid best price and average manufacturing price, these are confusing concepts, even to people who've been in them for 10 to 15 years. They're difficult to amend at the federal level, even when there's consensus, and there is not. And they can be interpreted differently from administration to administration, regardless of partisan influence. Just simply changes at CMS can change how these things can be interpreted. You've probably experienced that in your Medicaid programs at smaller levels, but sometimes it can be at the larger level as well over the years. And the anti-kickback statutes and STARK laws, those are very well intended, but also can have unintended consequences of forcing duplication. And they're confusing legally as well. And it's just another policy barrier to get a favorable interpretation. And then being able to rely on a favorable interpretation is risky. So we're talking about risk. There's risk in how you interpret federal statutes, and they can change. So how do we solve that? Sorry, JP. How do we solve that? There is legislation at the federal level. You can see here the title and name of it. Sorry for the goofy, I'm just a bill graphic. I couldn't help myself on that one. And that legislation, as much legislation has, is just simply not advancing, even though there is some good discussion around it. CMS has taken a more positive approach recently. And while one rule came out under the Trump administration, the Biden administration is actually moving the rule forward on value-based payment arrangements and addressing this best price component. So allowing these pricing mechanisms within a value-based arrangement to meet the standards of the multiple best price component, meaning the states are still getting the best price, even though it's going to be through a different mechanism because of the value-based components that we're bringing to the table. That is expected to go live next month, which is a week away. So we won't hold our breath, but it has been advancing nicely enough, but that still leaves us with a path forward at the state level. And that is the state plan amendment process, which all of your states probably regularly do in various components of the Medicaid program, oftentimes unseen and frankly unspectacular, just minor administrative changes, or sometimes more substantive provider payment changes or access changes in the program. But it's a very known and transparent process that Medicaid programs have with the federal government, with CMS. It has a reasonable 90-day time frame, and then the federal government will ask questions or approve it, but it has a clear path of how state plan amendments work and are approved and sought. There are 11 states now. You can see the list before you. There are others exploring the issue as we speak. And the key element here is this is not a requirement. It is simply, does this work for your state? Do you want to pursue it? Do you want to pursue it with one class of drugs, with one drug, with one condition? It's up to you. The state plan amendment gives you that flexibility. And if you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. But it really is the flexible component of this that states are looking for. We have a saying in Medicaid, if you've seen one Medicaid program, you've seen one Medicaid program. So state to state, you choose your adventure, so to speak. Which brings us home in many ways. So the status quo is not quo, to quote someone from a different conversation. It's simply out of date. The current regs were established well before any of the things we're talking about today were really in a clear line of sight, even conceptually in some cases. The overarching federal policy is getting better, but probably not likely in the too near of term, aside from that rule, and who knows where that rule will go once it's actually live and being implemented. And we don't know the administrative burden that rule will bring. So it still leaves us at the state plan amendment process as the better mechanism. Again, as a former Medicaid director, and your teams in your states will know that process works, has a clear path, and you know what you're getting when you enter into that process. Some states will have different legislative involvement, whether it's informing the legislature or the legislature has to sign off. State to state, that's a different conversation, but this process itself is a known entity, a proven one that can work. JP, let's take it home.
Yeah, that's our conclusion. You can see the QR code there. That is a paper that we authored on this issue, detailing not only a lot that's in this slide and a lot of discussion, but also looking at the individual states and how their Medicaid is set up. You've also got a link down there to the CTT website with a number of other papers, including a shorter, this paper is around 10 pages. We've got a shorter 2-pager front and back. And if you're interested, called an Issues and Answers, that also deals with this issue, that's available for download on that's certainly available for sharing. Brooklyn, I don't know if I see Senator Falskowski on. If she is, we can hold questions or we can open up for questions. I know there was one in the chat around reinsurance.
Yeah, she had something come up at the last minute and wasn't able to join us, so we can go ahead and open it up to questions.
Okay, I saw one question related to how reinsurance will work on state retiree plans and other plans functionally. The big issue with reinsurance, if you look at it, is it's a risk spreading mechanism. So if you're looking at either inside Medicaid, if you're looking at reinsurance in the private insurance market and in the small group market, the ACA, anything across those lines, if you only have one insurer involved, unless there's state dollars going into a reinsurance program, really doesn't do a heck of a lot. But if you've got multiple insurers, it ensures that the risk is spread amongst those entities equally. I believe I've heard of a entity that had a significant number of high-risk individuals in their Medicaid program. Most of a particular disease state happened to enroll in one particular plan, and that meant that particular plan was unprofitable. With reinsurance, it's possible that there could have been an adjustment with that to spread that risk amongst all the Medicaid plans to make sure that the risk that's taken on is relatively equal. And so that was one of the ways you can sort of look at that. And again, in that paper with the QR code, we discussed the states that are using reinsurance for Medicaid, that are using reinsurance under their a preferred drug list. So there are a variety of things. It wasn't really entirely about this, but we're happy to talk more about it if there's more questions.
If you have a question, feel free. You can either put it in the chat or use the hand raising feature on Zoom. In the meantime, I have a question actually. When we're talking about measuring how, the performance on these, what metrics are they using? Or is it qualities, or how are they determining, what works, so to speak?
I can answer, Mike. I mean, it's very specific to the drug.
Exactly.
And again, you would look at, we talked a little bit about the drug that deals with, retina issues. There's a light test they're looking at. There's another drug that, functionally they're looking at lung function on a regular basis. And, point blank, in some cases, they're looking at whether or not a patient survives over a period of time. Again, if they've got a really serious condition and it lengthens their life, that's one point of discussion. So those are negotiated specifically based on the drug itself and based on what the concerns are. And there are issues that sort of attach with that, right? Because depending on how deeply you want to go in looking at the effectiveness of the drug, you may have to require additional exams. You may have to require additional sort of looks at the patient to sort of get there. And the question is, how do you pay for that on top of the existing drug cost? So that's something that's negotiated between the Medicaid program and the specific drug manufacturer to get a metric that sort of makes sense. And what we found when we surveyed, so the paper talks about a survey that we did, a sort of one-on-one question and answer with a number of Medicaid departments. And that's a big issue that they're looking at. And there's wildly divergent sort of opinions of how they want to gather that information. One state only wants claims information, and that's it. Other states want to look a little bit more in detail and are looking for, outside sort of research that sort of attaches. So again, it's specific to the state and it's specific to the drug.
Okay, I know we have a question. Carla, did you have a question you wanted to ask? Hang on, she's still muted. There you go.
No, I just thought that it was a really interesting presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And the paper really will take it deeper and give you some very good specific examples of how states are thinking about this in practical terms, ones that are doing it, ones that are thinking, and some of those contractual issues, because those will be the crux of the issue.
All right, well, if we don't have any, do we have any more questions? Am I forgetting anybody? All right, well, thank you, JP and Michael, for being with us today. And I think this is something legislators are going to have to know about, you know, or have to know about now, but especially in the future. So thanks for shedding some light on it. And thanks everybody else for being here.
And Brooklyn, we'll be talking a little bit more in a shorter way at the HHS task force meeting as well. So I'll be available there if folks are coming to the ALEC meeting and have additional questions.
Yeah, JP will be there and presenting, and I think we're going to do something at our Healthcare Academy, which is going to be in October. So anybody who's interested in that, just shoot me an email. It's broberts@alec.org. All right, well, thank you guys.
Thank you everybody for coming.
Thanks.
And for paying attention. So thank you very much.
On a Friday afternoon in the summer.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.